Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to CSIS. I'm Steve Morrison, Senior Vice President here and Director of our Global Health Policy Center, and we're delighted to be here today to have a conversation with Tom Bollyky of the Council on Foreign Relations, a colleague and good friend who's just published his sweeping and ambitious study, Plagues and the Paradox of Progress, Why the World is Getting Healthier in Worrisome Ways. Just published end of September by MIT Press. And congratulations, Tom, on this achievement. I want to first also offer special thanks to my colleague Samantha Stroman for pulling this all together. And a bit of an advertisement, Monday afternoon here, same space here on our second floor at 2 p.m. We'll be holding an event on North Korea and the perils or paradoxes of health in North Korea, a 19-minute video that we've just completed, along with a number of providers who are actively on the ground in North Korea to talk about the situation there, the impact of sanctions, the current realities, and what might be done about this. I personally, and we here, really take great pleasure in having book events for a number of reasons. One is that when really good books come forward, it's a really nice moment for celebration, and this is one of those moments. This is a terrific piece of work. We were able to host in the past Peter Piot when he published his memoir, No Time to Lose. We've been able to host an event with Helene Cooper when she published her personal memoir, House at Sugar Beach. These are just special occasions, and I realize that not everyone who comes for the same reason, and not everyone comes with the opportunity to read the book ahead. But we want to have a conversation with you, and we'll get to that point. And we want to begin with Tom doing a quick overview of what's in the book so that we sort of start from that point, and then we'll have a conversation, the two of us, but then we'll quickly broaden that out. This important new book comes at a particular fraught moment in time, it seems to me. The field of global health is in the midst of an uncertain and confusing and uncomfortable passage right now. Donor financing for infectious disease control has plateaued and is decline, while low-income national governments are both loath to pick up the slack, and state leaders, especially in Africa, have largely exited the stage. Expensive and competing priorities spotlighted in the Sustainable Development Goals, non-communicable diseases, universal health coverage, are capturing the headlines at glossy global summits and stand at the center of the WHO vision set forth by Director General Dr. Tedros for revitalizing the World Health Organization and leading towards a world where there will be much higher coverage and much higher quality of coverage into the future. But there's a lot of uncertainty standing around all of these changes that are underway. It remains entirely unclear whether there will be adequate funding and sustained high-level political leadership to move these visions forward from aspiration to reality. In the background, we have populist nationalism that reigns here in Washington and in London and elsewhere across Europe, raising the specter of whether we really are seeing the permanent dissolution of the old liberal institutional order, which was fundamental to global health coming into being in the first place, and what will replace it. And here in Washington, we continue to have debates that sometimes seem a bit tired about vertical versus horizontal investments, and we see intensified competition for scarce dollars. And in the nervous period we're in right now, in the lead-up, the Global Fund and Gavi replenishments, we're seeing that played out. So it's in this moment that Tom has made his splash with this book. And as I think you'll hear from his presentation, he's inviting us to have a bigger debate, and it's a very refreshing and a provocative debate that he's calling for with the publication of this book. And as he will explain, there's a sort of core central aim, which is to explain the paradox of progress in infectious diseases. I'll let him explain what that means, but it's something that forces us to reconsider. So he will be doing that snapshot in just a minute as a prelude to our conversation. A few more words about Tom and this book. This is a very impressive contribution. It's in the tradition of William McNeill's Plagues and Peoples. He built systematically on his many years since 2011 at the Council on Foreign Relationship, leading research and writing on non-communicable diseases, on international trade and investment, on law, regulation, and technological innovation. And if you have the chance to read this book, it'll impress you the remarkable command that he brings to this task of bringing together history, technology, medicine, public health, political science into the argument. And he combines that also with a very fluid and easy writing style that is quite accessible and indeed quite pleasurable to read. I think it's meant intentionally to reach a broader audience than just us here, and I think that's a very refreshing change as well, that this is something that will have an audience of non-experts, an audience of people who want to know more about this topic because they're concerned with this world that we live in and how to think about the future. He's very careful, as you'll see and hear, in weaving a position between optimism and pessimism, but he does make a case for fundamental insecurity that lies beneath what we've achieved and what lies ahead. There are multiple points in which there are fairly tough statements made about the instability that lies ahead, given the paradox that he will unpack for us. So he's forcing us to think again, to question what has been accomplished after a period of remarkable and historic investments in global health. What has that left us with in the broader context? And has it or has it not achieved the basis for stability, good governance, and prosperity? Or has it had mixed effects with inadvertent effects that have made, at times, things worse? He's asking us, why should we be worried? Or he's trying to argue that we should be worried. And the question that he leaves us is, how worried should we be? And what are we going to come up with as a strategy looking ahead to the future? And I think the last point is the one that I think is most valuable, because this does bring us to a point of trying to answer the so what question by saying that donors, policymakers, senior level strategists, not just Americans, but people across the spectrum who are important in this debate, need to rethink what is feasible and what is going to be most impactful looking ahead into the future. So please join me in welcoming Tom here, and I'm going to ask him to take over and lead us through a quick summary, and then we'll begin our conversation. Thank you very much.
Steve was actually the person who first had me write a paper when I came out of government in 2009 in global health, and has roped me into doing more on policy. So if you hate this book, you should direct some of your ire towards Steve for setting me down this path. The last thing I will say is, ironically, for a book about the decline of infectious disease, I'm a little under the weather. You may hear from my voice, so I will get through this presentation. But if you hear me hacking away, you can take pleasure in the microbes getting their revenge against me. I'm going to start with a overview of the book so you can get a broad sense of its argument. I will start with really mostly just the problem and leave the solutions or potential solutions for my conversation with Steve afterwards. But let's start with the good news. The good news is in 1950, in nearly 100 countries, including nearly every country in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, 1 out of 5 children under the age of 5, like this little girl, perished before their 5th birthday. Today, that happens nowhere, in no countries. For the first time in recorded human history, bacteria, viruses, and other infectious diseases do not cause the majority of death or disability in any region of the world. In the past, these types of health gains were the path to prosperity. The economist Robert Gordon has cited the decline of infant mortality in the United States between 1890 and 1950 as one of the single most important facts in the history of American economic growth. China in the 1950s was poorer than Chad, Benin, and Niger when it embarked on an all-out peasant-based war against infectious diseases that helped create the conditions for it later to have its rise to global economic power. But that's not what we're seeing in many countries today. And to explain that, I'm going to use the example of Niger and these boys and girls who are the beneficiaries of much of this global health progress. So again, let's start with the good news. Average life expectancy in Niger has, average life expectancy at birth has increased 21 years since 1980, from 39 years to 60. Child mortality has, over the same time period, fallen 73%. The burden of infectious disease in Niger has fallen by more than 1/3. But the government of Niger spends just $17 per person per year on health care. Niger is poorer today than it was in 1980. It remains a very corrupt country with endemic corruption, ranking very low or very high, depending on how you read it, on Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. A child entering school in Niger can expect just 5.4 years of schooling, which is tied for the least amount in the world. Niger's fertility rate has barely moved since 1980. Out of the 190 countries that the United Nations ranked on human development, Niger finished 189th, second to last. So the question is with this growing young adult population, what awaits them as they move into the workforce, as they seek the opportunities that young adults do everywhere? Niger has additional problem, which a lot of sub-Saharan African countries do, but particularly Niger, in that it's particularly exposed to the forces of climate change, which limit the opportunity for agriculture to employ many of these young adults, or for herding to employ many of these young adults, which compounds the problem. So this is a challenge. We've made great progress. Well, the good news, again, is we've made great progress in reducing child mortality and the burden of infectious disease in deeply poor countries with dysfunctional governments and limited infrastructure. But many of them have remained deeply poor countries with dysfunctional governments and limited infrastructure. And without that broader development, that has meant many of the good byproducts that come with better health, like a rising young adult population, less deadly cities, a shift in health needs or needs in general to adults, are now sources of or risks of potential instability and impoverishment instead of the engine of prosperity that they should be. So let's take those one by one. Increase in the young adult population. According to the World Bank, by 2050, low and middle income countries will add 2.1 billion working age adults to these populations. At current employment rates in those countries, that means nearly 900 million people without jobs, looking for work. Each year, for the next 10 years, sub-Saharan Africa will add 11 million young adults to its workforce. Currently, they're producing about 1 to 2 million new jobs per year, formal employment. So when faced with those circumstances, a young adult in Niger is doing, frankly, what you or I would do. They're moving. And you're seeing that increase. In 1990, fewer than 1 million people migrated out of sub-Saharan Africa to OECD nations. 2013, that grew to 6 million. Now, mind you, that's despite the fact that the share of refugees in that movement has declined. So now only 1 out of 10 migrants leaving sub-Saharan Africa are refugees. According to the International Monetary Fund, that is expected or projected to increase, migrants out of OECD are projected to increase to 18 million in 2040 and 34 million in 2050. Now, of course, an increase in migrants at this desperate rate is causing a lot of the instability and populism we've seen in wealthy nations. But frankly, my greater concern is that a young adult population historically is the engine of prosperity. It's the future for a country and a continent. And increasingly, sub-Saharan Africa's future is leaving. And that should be a concern to all of us. So you've also seen, let's now move to less deadly cities. Historically, cities were only possible in wealthy nations. You had primate cities, capital cities like Rome, ancient Rome, that were the size of 1 million people, or industrial centers that could draw farmhands to put down their hoes and walk towards the city lights for manufacturing jobs or in the textile mills. Those were the only cities that could really sustain a large population, because packing people together with their animals in a small space led to the spread of infectious disease. So most urbanization historically happened through migration. That's when wealthy nations started to decrease their burden of infectious diseases at the beginning of the 20th century. That meant cities started to grow, and urbanization is a good thing. There is no country in the world that has become wealthy without urbanizing first. Cities allow people to trade ideas, start businesses, to benefit from shared investments in urban infrastructure, agglomeration for you economists. So urbanization is a good thing. And what we've seen since 1960 is that poorer and poorer countries have been able to urbanize. So the level of wealth you had to have at least 1/3 of your country urbanized has declined significantly over that time. The challenge with that is it's also meant that cities are growing more naturally by the increase in the birth rate being much higher than the death rate. And the rates of urbanization are 3 times the fastest we've ever seen in some urbanization that, for instance, happened in New York City in the early 20th century. And that has meant that you've had some cities increase beyond the boundaries of their infrastructure. There is now nearly 1 billion people who live in slums. That's projected to increase to 2 billion people over the next 30 years. There are some countries like the Central African Republic where 96% of the urban population lives in slums. Let's take Dhaka, for example. Dhaka, for those of you who have not been there, is a city of 16 million people living in the space the size of Greensboro, North Carolina. The average speed of traffic in Dhaka has declined to 4 miles per hour, which is a little faster than walking. Each day, Dhaka residents lose 3.2 million working hours to congestion, which means that these cities are growing fast enough that a lot of the economic benefits that we've seen from urbanization historically are being overwhelmed by congestion. And if that persists or worsens, then these cities will be anomalous in a different way. They will be the first cities in human history to make their residents poorer instead of wealthier. Let's move on to health. So the 2014 Ebola outbreak in West Africa demonstrated very well to a lot of us in global health the limitations of health systems to address unexpected dangerous disease events. But it's not just on emerging infectious disease that you see these concerns or these limitations in health systems. You've seen a dramatic increase, a surge, in cancers, heart disease, and diabetes in low-income countries that is 3 or 4 times as fast as we've seen in human history. Let's take Bangladesh as an example again. In 1990, Bangladesh had 28% of its total death and disability devoted to non-communicable diseases. By 2040, that's expected to reach 82%, when that will be roughly the same as it is in the United States. That is traversing a territory in 50 years that took the United States 200 years to traverse. Non-communicable diseases require more chronic care, a different health system, frankly. And these burdens are happening in countries that are significantly poor, with more limited health systems, and happening in working age populations. 35 to 55 is when the bulk of the burden is happening in low-income countries, and these people are parents and, again, members of the workforce. So what's the lesson to draw from this book? Lesson, and I want to be quite clear, is not that global health doesn't matter and we shouldn't invest in global health. Actually, the point of the book is exactly the opposite. That global health matters enormously, and it matters in ways that we don't always track. It is not just about saving people's lives and reducing unnecessary suffering, although it is certainly also about that. But the way we pursue global health shapes economies, it shapes cities, and it shapes how the movement of peoples occur. So it's critical that we invest more in global health and embed it in an overall development strategy. But we shouldn't forget that the fight between man or humankind, more appropriately, and microbe is not over. Antimicrobial resistance is a big concern. Avian influenza and other potentially pandemic diseases are continue to be worth our heavy investment. There is no worthier goal for humankind than investing in reducing the unnecessary deaths and suffering in children, and we shouldn't forego that. But it's important that these strategies be broader, be embedded in a larger development strategy that invests in what happens to these infants and children who are now surviving past adolescence into adulthood. It is not a problem that will merely, or a scenario that will merely take care of itself. So the message I'm hoping that people will come from the book is there's a frequent reference to this being the age of miracles in global health. And there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, again, the declines in child mortality, the reductions in infectious disease in deeply poor countries, that for people that, like I, who have been doing this for a couple of decades now, never didn't seem possible. And that is a wonderful, important thing. But we have to remember that these are inputs into the ultimate goal, which is that the real miracles in global health will occur when the people who are benefiting from these health improvements have the same opportunities to seize the prosperity and the meaningful life that once came with health improvements in the past. And with there, I'll stop.
Thank you very much. In reading this book, and asking, well, what is the paradox, and why are we worried? You seem to offer a couple of answers to the paradox question, and you've touched on some of them in your presentation. That the argument seems to be twofold. One is that we've had all of these investments in public health and the introduction on scale of medical advances, technological advances into these environments, but they have not been accompanied by the same set of institutional developments that we saw in the 19th and early 20th centuries in our own country and in parts of Europe or in mid-century China. We didn't have investments in basic public health institutions in the same degree: quarantine, vaccination, housing, clean water, sanitation. We haven't seen the same level of responsive government and oversight, and we haven't seen the wealth generation and employment generation that have accompanied those phases. So the sequencing and the interconnection between public health investments and everything else that happened is a different pattern altogether, and one that leaves us looking at these investments in low-income countries in the last 20 years and saying, wait a second, those look remarkably narrow and freestanding today. against a backdrop, as you say, that has not changed in some ways. And it leads you to be alarming. And then, of course, when you save lives and you extend lives and your population grows. Yeah. So then you get to the second thing about the paradox of progress, which you paint so well, which is the tremendously ferocious speed of a few different transformations that are all happening at the same time. You're arguing that urbanization is proceeding at a pace unlike anything else we've seen. NCDs are proceeding at a pace unlike anything we've seen. And the demographic shifts that are generating ever larger youth segments are accelerating too. And that convergence of those really remarkably fast phenomenon were not the same as before, particularly when you look at how they are blocked from, as you say, migration. You have surplus youth that would have fueled economic growth in the United States or in Europe or in China in earlier periods. They don't have that opportunity to fuel growth, but they would migrate to higher growth opportunities normally, and they're not. That's just not happening in this case. So you have blockages in this period. So have I captured the paradox that you're trying to enumerate for us correctly? And what does that lead us to say in terms of what the future is going to look like?
Great. No, you did a marvelous job of, in just a couple minutes, summarizing what took me more than 200 pages. So that's terrific. Thank you. You still need to read the book. The paradox is simply this. By addressing one set of problems and making progress against it, we've created a new set of problems. And that's what's paradoxical. The reason why that is occurring is, as you mentioned, the declines, well, it's two things. One, the declines in infectious disease have occurred in a different way than they happened in the past. So more than 60% of the added life expectancy that the United States has experienced since 1870 occurred before the widespread availability of antibiotics and the development of most vaccines. It occurred through social regulations and public health and reducing child labor and overcrowding in factories, pasteurization of milk, sanitation, chlorination, and filtration. And by making these investments, not only did we drive health gains, but they had other benefits as well. They meant that the improvement of water supplies made it possible for more manufacturing in cities. The same models of referenda and municipal financing that we use to build those water systems, clean water systems, in urban environments were later used to build roads and ports and railways. The social or the government regulations around crowded tenements or labor regulation or even compulsory immunization in the case of smallpox set the early precedent for government regulations of compulsory schooling. So building capable governance, building infrastructure, not only allowed us to achieve our health gains, it then created the conditions for economic growth when we had a young adult population. China benefited because they had, despite a disastrous scenario, people think of sub-Saharan Africa or many of these countries like Niger as hopeless. But China was poorer than Niger in the 1950s. It was about to head into a famine. Cultural revolution. At the death of Mao, China did not look promising at all. But they had also reduced their child mortality to the point where they had, between 1949 and 1974, increased their life expectancy by 21 years. And that meant in post-Mao era reforms, they had this young adult population ready to take those factory jobs and man those assembly lines that allowed them to grow. So in part, this is being driven by the fact that it's happened differently. But it's also a different moment than other countries had to face in having their health improvements. So countries now having these health improvements and having large young adult populations are competing against the countries that had their health improvements earlier. So, at this point, the manufacturing represents the same share of the overall GDP in sub-Saharan Africa as it did in 1967%. And they can't dislodge factory owners to move from Asia to Africa. So that's a challenge. We are also adopting, as you rightly pointed out, policies around immigration and trade that make it harder for these countries to grow their economies, to employ their young adult populations, and also reduce some of the pressure that one faces from a bulge in a young adult population that was available to other countries in the past. So it's these differences that are producing this paradox.
Now, you wrote this with the idea of trying to stir a bit of a wake-up call. You know, every chapter has a section that says, "I'm worried." Every section sort of rolls you through a discussion of things, and you go, "This really worries me." And so, after reading the book, one of the things that came to mind was, is worry the right word? Because as I stacked up the multiple things that you were recounting, and you had some very sharp statements about, don't be fooled, we're heading into a very unstable future. I mean, there are a couple of statements that you made that were pretty tough in terms of, particularly for Africa, that this is not a gloomy, this is a pretty gloomy picture. Yeah. When you add in all of these structural factors and historical factors, and a world that is now hostile, geopolitically hostile in terms of trade and immigration and other things, why not say alarm rather than worry? Worry suggests that, a little indigestion, but not much beyond that.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. So I think we spend a lot of time in aid and global health deciding whether or not we should be pessimistic or optimistic. Are we impatient for optimism, or are we in the, well, I won't name specific writers, but are we viewing that aid is a worthless pursuit and these countries are basket cases and we'd be better off not getting involved in those environments? And I have to admit, for me, myself, I don't think it's important whether we're pessimistic or optimistic. I think it's important that we agree on what the actual goals of what we're doing are and the processes by which we should achieve them. And I think we invested in reducing child mortality and reducing infectious diseases in part because we could achieve progress here, and there's a humanitarian benefit to it, and I'm all very much in favor of that. But in part because in the past, reductions in infectious disease and child mortality did lead to prosperity. It's not a foolhardy notion to invest in these areas. But what I think we may have, what is becoming clearer is that investing in that alone will not allow us, there's no shortcut to prosperity in these countries. The road to health may have shortcuts, but the road to prosperity and inclusion does not. And by being limited or investing in a somewhat imbalanced way, by not pairing our health investments with investments in the human capital of these rising young adult populations, we've created a new set of challenges. And it's something both that's ultimately the responsibility of the national governments to address, but we have an important role in supporting them in doing so.
Yeah. I mean, I understand that you're trying to navigate between the optimists, the Hans Roslings and the Steven Pinkers, who are trying to, at a macro level, say, wait a second, look at all of these historical indicators. And you're trying to navigate between them and that school of thought, which is powerful, and the skeptics or pessimists, the William Easterlys or the Dembisa Moyos or others. And those schools of thought are out there. And I think my sense also is that you're worried that your argument not be twisted in some fashion, because those who might want to discredit the validity of foreign aid might grab upon portions of what you say and twist it a bit and turn it against what you're really trying to say. So I understand you're making a complicated and nuanced argument that forces consideration of some dark realities that we don't often talk about. But you're trying to avoid people tipping into those too much or turning them to purposes that you're not really comfortable with. But I also think you take a little bit of the sting out of the argument. The argument is, to me, I found very powerful in terms of saying we really are heading into a very difficult situation where there's no clear solutions and we're going to get to what the solutions might look like, but there's no easy solutions. If there were, we would be migrating towards those. And the trend lines, when we factor in particularly populist nationalism and what that means for migration, for foreign aid, for trade relationships, for multilateralism, for turning everything into transactional calculations. Yeah. That becomes like pouring fuel upon all of these different accelerating trends that you've talked about. So that's just one point that I think that you could step up, you could amp up the sort of intensity of the argument, because you do seem to be arguing a certain urgency in looking at this. Yeah. Would you agree?
I agree. If you're not worried about that statistic about 2.1 billion young adults being added by 2050 and 900 million of them at current rates being without work, I don't know what else would worry you. That's a recipe for instability in those nations. It's a recipe for instability in other nations. And given the scale of that, if it doesn't worry you, you should. I will say, when I wrote this book, I thought that it might receive a more hostile reception from the global health community or the aid community. And one of the things that happened, and we've talked about this, you and I, offline, is it turns out the bank and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are here. The same week this book came out, the Gates Foundation released its Goals Keepers report, which expresses the same concerns about rapidly growing countries that threaten to undo all the progress that has occurred. The World Bank's fundamental strategy for the coming year is trying to find a way to get national governments to invest in their young adult populations, invest more in education, invest more in quality health systems, to address the fact that you have these rising populations and not the support to address them. So I do think that there are a lot of people who are expressing concern. I actually think this book expresses more alarm than comes across in both of those reports, because I think people are fearful that this message will be misused. But we really are at an inflection point. If you're not worried about these trends and don't see the need to invest in improving the capability of these governments to put people, this rising young adult population, in a position to succeed, you really should be. And I think this could be one of these issues that really defines the next several decades.
So you've moved a little bit towards the recommendations. There's, in the closing chapter, you wrap up 3 recommendations for what national governments in low-income countries should be doing, and 3 or 4 recommendations on how donor practices and thinking should change. Yeah. Why don't you walk us through a bit of those? What are the top-line priorities in your view? You've already signaled a bit of this, but for the purposes of this audience, what is it that you're arguing the national governments that are in question, that face the gravest risk, what should they do?
Great. So I would put it really in 2 buckets. The first is, I think there is, it's important to increase accountability and transparency of national governments to invest in their young adult population. We can debate the specific measures or the quality of the human capital index. There are now several out there, so that debate is occurring. But I think the fundamental notion of trying to make national governments more accountable, whether by linking it to financing or making it more clear to their populations, is really important. I think that we have moved away, in part because of the experiences of 15 years ago, we've moved away from promotion of good governance and democracy and human rights in a way that I think was a mistake, given what we're seeing now in terms of the capability. All that falls into the accountability piece. Then I do think there are some critical investments that need to occur both through the national government and through entities that have an interest in their well-being and future, which should be most countries, and especially this one. I do think that we have an urgent need, particularly in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, to invest more in voluntary family planning and reproductive health. Unfortunately, that's coming at a moment where we're moving in the opposite direction as this country. But investments in trying to, again, reduce the birth rate to just the children that women want to have, I think could make a big difference. You're starting to see that happen in places like Kenya and Senegal, which are seeing these reductions. So it's certainly possible. Girls' education, along the same lines, has economic benefits, but also reductions in fertility adds people to the workforce. So that's really important. Quality of education is going to be critical. Particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, as we mentioned, because of these competitive dynamics with countries that had the good fortune to have their health gains first. We're not likely to see manufacturing be the engine of prosperity in sub-Saharan Africa. We are not. And how we achieve employment for this 11 million young adults being added to the workforce each year is a serious challenge. And you can look at the other areas. If it's not through goods, then it needs to be through services. But services are hard to trade, so it's important to do more on trade policy to try to enable more of that to occur. But it also requires a higher level of productivity, which means more education and more investment in educational quality. And while schooling rates have increased dramatically in a lot of sub-Saharan African countries, quality is abysmal in many countries, even countries like Ethiopia, which are doing comparatively well. Despite the fact that low-income countries have been growing, you haven't seen a corresponding growth in the amount being spent on healthcare. And the last statistics I saw was in, I think, 2015, 2016. Ethiopia, again, the fastest growing economy in sub-Saharan Africa, invests only $23 per person in its own healthcare. If healthcare investment in low and middle income countries tripled between 1990 and 2013, but it's still really low. All 48 governments of sub-Saharan Africa invest less in healthcare than the government of Australia, with 20 million people. This investment in human capital needs to change. So to the extent that we can make it easier for countries by working with them to extend the global health platforms in a way that they're more broadly usable to addressing other health needs, to the extent that we can look at chronic care models that are lower costs and less dependent on infrastructure, to the extent that we can try to replicate the successes of countries like Vietnam that were quite poor and have done really well on educational quality, and look into what has driven that, I think it makes a lot of sense.
Thank you. So you're arguing human capital needs to be front and center. Education and health, human capital investment, inequality and scale. You're arguing for embrace of primary health care at the community level as a key component element. You're saying they need to really address the NCD crisis in some better way than has been done up to now.
Or at all.
And on the urbanization piece, the megacities, which is one of the most powerful chapters in a very powerful book, the discussion around the megacities, only 2 of which are in Africa, the majority in South Asia, right?
Yeah.
In Asia. but staggering scale and staggering speed of growth. What are governments supposed to do?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I mean, as the book does talk a fair bit about megacities because they're a very vivid example of these challenges. But most of the urbanization in sub-Saharan Africa is happening in cities of 1 million inhabitants or fewer, but it's happening incredibly rapidly. So the challenges you see in a city like Dhaka are happening in a galaxy of cities, urban environments across that setting with even less infrastructure. The challenge that you have is it's really hard to build urban infrastructure after you have a city. It becomes a lot more expensive and more difficult to move people. So like in many areas, there are not a lot of easy solutions, but one that people talk about that makes good sense is more easily enforceable, transferable property rights to create a property tax system in those environments, create some value in the land, potentially draw more investment. That's one area that people have looked at. That makes good sense.
And for donors, any other further thoughts on how donors, in your mind, should change their thinking and strategies? You suggested some of this. But.
Absolutely. I mean, I think ultimately the realization has to be that I think much of the approach we've taken in global health, and it's achieved great benefits in the targets we've sought to address, is by providing the inputs we've wanted to provide for the diseases that we've wanted to address. And that is a very supply-driven model of global health. And I think we need to shift more to a demand-driven model that reflects the broader healthfulness, the well-being of the population, and less about whether we're achieving specific disease targets and more about the health of the population that goes through those programs. And I think that's something we still don't have a good handle on. I think there is some progress being made. PEPFAR is investing more in being more broadly concerned about wellness and looking at pilots around hypertension and other programs, and I think that's a good start, but we need to move in those areas a lot faster, because if we want governments to assume these care platforms, they're only going to do it if it is broadly useful to addressing those countries' needs.
Thank you. Why don't we open up to hear from our audience, and if everybody would simply put a hand up, identify yourself, and speak very succinctly. We'll bundle together several different comments, remarks. Down in front here. So please just put your hand up and we'll come to you with a microphone. Yes, sir.
Dan Lieberman. You've talked mainly about the nations that are of low economic status, but isn't health also an economic problem, even in the nations that are well off, that the disparities of income that has been shown, that disparities in income and wealth do aggravate the health problem, and many nations which have lower disparities in income really have better health.
Hold for a second. Sure. Other, Carl, right over, Namisha, or here, Claire. Carl.
Hi, Carl Hoffman. I look forward to reading the book, Tom. If you were, I'm sure I'll emerge alarmed as opposed to worried. So based on what we've heard here, I really like the connection that you drew originally to the fundamental importance of governance issues in trying to set the conditions where these investments can really be leveraged. And I guess if you were emperor and had the current pool of resources that was going into development, global health, but development broadly, and you could divide it differently from the way it is now and fix some of the imbalances, and let's say, governance, human capital, and health, how would you divide it up among those three baskets, if you could?
Thank you. Right here, Chris, and then in the back. Yes.
Hi, Chris Collins. Thank you for this fascinating presentation, and I look forward to reading the book. Sort of building on that too, though, one thing we've seen in terms of the politics of global health and what motivates policymakers and keeps those investments alive is our ability to talk about results constantly. And thinking about, you're encouraging us to think more broadly about how we invest in human capital and what people need. be more demand-driven. How do we do that, regardless of whether the total amount invested increases or stays flat, separate of that? How do we move to that broader lens of investment and still keep being able to, are we going to be able to talk about results in the rapid-fire way that we've been doing in global health? Do we need to talk about it differently, or would you structure your platform in a certain way to be able to, how would you structure this broadening so that you're able to go back every year to the lawmaker and say, I'm seeing results even in these tough places?
Great. We'll go one more and then come back to you. Yes?
Great. Good afternoon. Ben Bellows, Population Council and NIVI Inc.
Speak up, please.
Sure. Ben Bellows, Pop Council. A couple of questions. Playing off the demand angle in global health, I was wondering, historically, were there examples that you could point to where that approach was successful? Because what I was hearing in some of the historical reflection was this notion that there was voluntary collective action, more of building a supply side response to public health problems.
Yeah.
And then secondly, the role of, if we think of states as service delivery platforms, one of the largest platforms, if you will, is Facebook. To what extent do we find digital solutions that might generalize the notion of property rights and allow us to unlock the collateral in our own data as a way for structuring future investment?
Great. All right.
Over to you. Over to you. I'm not answering any of those questions.
No. But just to keep me apprised of all the ones that came up, but I'll
We had one broad question.
all right.
Around inequality.
Absolutely. So let's start with inequality. Inequality, without a doubt, is a driver of poor health outcomes. That's certainly true in the United States. That's true in other countries as well. You just need to follow what's happened on maternal mortality in the United States to be a great example of that, where you see completely different experiences based on race and income on maternal mortality outcomes. So without a doubt, that is a big driver. This book focuses primarily on this drive for global health and what it has meant for the world, so it's less on that topic, but it's not a reflection of it not being important in high-income countries as well as poor countries. On the question of how to divvy up in terms of our current spending, whether or not we should move money from global health into democracy promotion or good governance or on voluntary family planning. Ideally we'd see more money in these spaces. There's given the size of the challenge, I mean, for goodness sakes, the amount of attention migration gets and the amount of money we're spending on what we're spending it on, what you could do for addressing the drivers of migration. I mean, we're in an environment now where our policies on immigration and trade, for instance, go completely contrary to one another, where we're trying to restrict trade with low-wage manufacturing sources. At the same time, we're trying to restrict immigration from those same countries, and that makes no sense at all. So ideally you would see more investment in that space. I do think, given the size of these challenges in some of these countries, we do need to invest more in voluntary family planning, and we do need to invest more in governance as a strategy for improving health outcomes. So if it came down to it, would I shift money? Yes, I'd shift money. Ideally, I don't think it should be necessary given the amount of money we are putting into things that are meant to be addressing these same concerns and are completely useless.
Chris asked, what if you shift away from the current focus on results to some different strategy? What's the
Yeah, I mean, to me,
calculation?
I think we chose the metrics. We chose, one, because they're measurable, but two, because historically they've been metrics of progress. That reductions of child mortality, reductions in these infectious diseases, the normal thing in history that happens is they lead to prosperity. And you read history of global health, that was some of the motivation around it, not all the motivation, but some of the motivation around it is that these would be the metrics. And I think that's what's driving, whether it's Han Rosling's book or Steven Pinker's book, is these are the metrics we've looked at in history as elements of progress. But unfortunately, they are not being accompanied by the broader benefits that they used to. So they may not be, in this current environment, very good metrics of broader prosperity and development. And I think this whole exercise, this big fat in development happening right now in human capital, is an effort to drive better metrics that measure the true progress in nations. And I think there is an opportunity to do this. There's a lot of people investing in trying to, instead of looking at specific disease targets, trying to estimate countries, the share of their burden that is avertable as a way of measuring progress. These human capital metrics on quality as opposed to years of schooling, looking at ways of trying to generate this kind of progress. I get it. I mean, you ultimately have to show up at Congress and you want a single sheet that shows this is what we've achieved and it's something we need to do. But what I think needs to be reflected is that these are not proving to be the good measures of broader progress that they used to be. And giving people what ultimately now may be bad data in terms of what we've promised would come along with these things is not a solution. Bad data is not a good answer to the need for good data. On the question of have we ever seen this approach work, we haven't really tried very much. So each of these chapters is built around a theme. And the second chapter focuses on the history of our global health efforts, which really is largely a history of colonialism and military enterprise. That is what led us to invest in global health in countries, and they have been done in military-style campaigns, really from the beginning. There have been points, though, we've had a debate about this, multiple points, and I agree with Steve, there's nothing more tiresome than talking about horizontal and vertical, so I'm not going to talk about that at all. But I will bring up one gentleman that some people in the room may have heard of, but others may not, is Wycliffe Rose, who is the first director of the International Health Program at the Rockefeller Foundation. And he argued, in terms of what the foundation was doing around hookworm and its other programs, that these really are just demonstration projects to show that the ultimate goal is to convince the national governments that investing in health is worthwhile and to show how to do it, and to work with them how to do it, and then leave it. And he was forced out. And he was forced out with the statement that this will never happen in 1,000 years. And that is something I don't think we have really tested yet. But it is, you're right, this is not something that we've done a lot of in the past, but it clearly under these circumstances, I think it's something we need to do more in. On the capability of digital platforms or data, the jury is still out on this. The last time I've looked at the research, it's hard to draw out exactly what the great interventions have been so far through mobile or digital platforms, but obviously the fact that you're looking at target countries and populations where the great advantage is their access to smartphones and limited infrastructure, we got to keep trying to take advantage of that, but mobile health has not lived up to, I think, in most areas, the promise that many of us had hoped to date.
Thank you. Let's take another round. Gentleman right here, and then Jen. So right here, and then Namisha, yes, right there, and then across to... Yes,
Hi.
please identify yourself.
Yes, indeed. My name is Owen Wrigley. I want to thank you. Your marvelous presentation. I'd be pretty much entirely in your camp on almost all the arguments. I want to raise what appears to be a second paradox that's occurring. And, I back up that in the previous incarnation of the U.S. government's emerging pandemic threats program, they had a project that focused on human behavior. What is it people are doing that lead to spillovers, amplification?
Yeah.
In the current iteration, it's not there. You say decided it was a little too difficult, too many IRBs, the like of that. Anyway, for that project, I was the director. And my interest is more in sort of not so much the poorest of the country. I mean, I do have interest, but I'm looking at the emerging countries. Say, let's take a Thailand or Bangkok or a Ho Chi Minh City, where you have an emergent aspect aspiring middle class who are now moving into very dense high-rises. And with cultural propensities for a fastidiousness, what you have now is a skyrocketing incidence of allergies, asthma, the like. So what we're doing is we're producing very dense populations of immunologically naive populations. And all you need is a cultural holiday, rite of passage, ritual that Uncle Mong comes from the village with a bit of bat meat or something like that. And you've tossed, a spark into an incredibly dense pile of tinder. So the spillover risks haven't really changed, but the amplification risks are now just skyrocketing, particularly, as I say, I see it as sort of another paradox of the development, that these high rises are often seen as points of progress, but they may be introducing an extreme risk in particularly those areas where the pandemic, the SARS, the MERS are emerging from. Your thoughts?
Hold for a second.
Thanks. Jen Cates, Kaiser Family Foundation. Hi, Tom, and thank you, because I've read the book and think it's great, so everyone should read it. And I've said this to Tom as well, that it's rare that you have a book come out that actually does, I think, move the thinking forward, so congratulations on that. My question is one you and I have talked about it's to some degree, but maybe not since the book came out, which is how, and I think the argument really works, but how do you explain HIV in this scenario? Because if you think back to when HIV was spreading rapidly in sub-Saharan Africa in the 80s, and very few people recognized that by the 90s it had actually started to affect the age structure and entire population structures of many of the countries we're talking about. It was because of that, finally, that recognition for a whole variety of reasons, that aid by the US and others, A, increased, and B, really went to health. Prior to that period, the US invested in health and other things. If that hadn't happened, we would have had a whole other trajectory, not the one we're in now. So I guess I don't know if it's a question, but was there another way to do it that would have had a better result or as good a result? Because I think you wouldn't argue, nor would I, that should not have happened, but maybe it should have happened in a different way. So,
Thank you. Any other remarks, questions, comments? Yes, Felice, right in front here. Amisha.
Hi, thank you, Steve and Tom. I'm Felice Apter. I'm from Georgetown University and the Center for Global Development. And I was really interested when you started your conversation, Tom, of looking at Niger, which was a great, obvious example, but you also talked about it in terms of the corruption index, and you talk about transparency and good governance. And since you've been thinking about this a lot more than maybe many of us in the room, I would love for you to hypothesize a little bit about the role and the importance of good governance in terms of both making sure that health is available, but also in terms of thinking through what the future of work looks like. I think you already mentioned manufacturing probably isn't going to be that. And so it's almost like there's going to need to be a real jump start for something in terms of employment opportunities. Thank you.
Anyone else? We'll come back to you, Tom.
Great.
We have Owen, Jen, and Felice.
Fantastic. So on the issues you've raised, I couldn't agree with you more on the pandemic piece. I think aversion behavior is what really ultimately drives people's unwillingness to, or the behavior they have in the midst of an outbreak, drives what the economic consequences and health consequences of that outbreak are. And we see that in outbreak after outbreak, that it's really those behaviors that drive the real health and economic consequences. So I'm sorry that that's not an area we're investing more in, because it's critically important. On the question of people being immunologically naive in these settings, I do think it's a really vivid example of the problems talked in the book more broadly around infectious disease, that in part it is, the example that you have is, or that I tried to make clear, is that the fact that we're arguing infectious diseases decline doesn't mean we shouldn't be worried about the risk of pandemic events. In fact, the two are related. That it is in part by the broader byproducts of everyday infectious diseasing decline that you create a greater risk of pandemic events, in part through urbanization and growth in populations. But there's a lot of talk about there being more outbreaks than there used to be. They're actually not per population. But the risks of those outbreaks are greater, and because of these factors. So I completely agree with you. On, what was the next question? On, HIV. So on HIV, as you know well, I think HIV created modern global health. It was really the response to that, and specifically to the absence of treatment in those environments, when you had this phenomenon of life-saving treatment in the United States and Europe come on board, and the fact that it was absent in many countries where the epidemic was expanding, or pandemic was expanding rapidly. It's actually the focus, as Jed knows well, the first chapter of the book. So I think it was critical that it was an emergency, that we invest in that space. I think HIV is anomalous in so many ways in global health, in the sense that it's primarily a disease of adults. It is a chronic condition. So there are a lot of things that just look so different about that response. But I do think one of the challenges that we faced over time in those programs is how to start to draw governments into them and use them as a broader platform for improving care. And that's not something we've mastered. So in the initial years, could we have done something different? I think probably not. Over time, have we done a great job at starting to make these chronic care platforms more broadly useful for governments? Probably not. And I don't know if we've made as good use of them once they were on the ground as we could have. The next question was... Felice, I remember the future work. What was the first part? Niger. So I think corruption plays a huge role in what we're seeing in these countries. The thing to remember, though, is that this is a difficult environment because China was completely corrupt in the Mao era and when it came out. So nobody would look at post-Mao China as a situation that was about to take off. So I don't foresee these problems as being completely damning, but I think the environment that these countries find themselves in is that it's just a much more competitive global environment, and the need to perform and have the government provide these services is greater. That it's not as, particularly from an international trade perspective, it is not the egalitarian moment that China found itself in the 1970s, where it could really take up slices of the manufacturing process and lift 600 million people out of extreme poverty. So it's more important that governments function better in those environments, and that's an area we've moved away from in terms of aid investments historically, and that needs to change. The future of the work issues is really hard. I think most people talk about small entrepreneurs and digital services, the gig economy in sub-Saharan Africa. And, I'm in general a big believer in, that ultimately things that have worked in the past, given the right circumstances, can work again. And sub-Saharan Africa is an environment where they're going to have to cut a new path. And they're going to have to do it at a time where the global infrastructure to support them is not there. I mean, the WTO is not looking at a digital trade agreement. You're not seeing a ton of support. Africa's in the midst now of trying to integrate in trade. There's not a lot of international support for that. What we're really going to do to enable these kinds of investments, which again, if you do see it's around entrepreneurialism and digital trade, requires human capital. Otherwise, they won't have the productivity you need to generate that kind of employment. So that is where Steve talks about an area that I'm alarmed about. The part of that book I'm most alarmed about is the young adult problem. More so than the urbanization, more so than these health concerns, because I really do think that the risk of reversion or instability is quite great.
Let me ask you, sort of in the closing part here, a couple of questions. One is, when I think about the audiences that are going to be the toughest audiences to reach, but the ones that you need to reach,
Yeah.
one is African and South Asian heads of state, leaders. And far too often they're not really part of the conversation, or they're not very visible in the conversation. They're preoccupied with other major problems. They may be in denial. They may feel these are not, that others own this problem. So you have this question of how do you get this conversation going with them? Then you have a problem with, in terms of major donors, you've got the problem of populist nationalism, where you have animosity or hostility to multilateralism, to trade alliances, to migration or migrants, to foreign aid, and climate change. Much of what you've described are, as drivers and as solutions, are things that ideologically are going to be very difficult to sort of take on board.
Yeah.
With that mindset or that ideological approach. So how do you make the argument to those two audiences? Not that there's a single, it'll be quite different, I would expect.
Yeah.
But let's start with African and South Asian leaders, and then let's move to sort of populist nationalists who are in Western powers.
Yeah. So I mean, I think the issue for national governments and countries is that we need to. I really do believe in this accountability piece. At the end of the day, I would think we need to continue to speak to leaders. We need to find a better way of reaching their populations in terms of trying to create higher expectations and higher accountability for leaders that are investing in the space. One worries these are long-term trends. And at the end of the day, that leaders will have the temptation, as in many of these areas, to push them off. And I don't foresee that changing unless the incentive structure for those leaders change. The bank
or the visible consequences of instability.
Consequences of instability, and the bank is trying to do that by tying it or trying to create not just the accountability, but also to link it to financing, and I think that's a really good idea. Whether or not they're successful in that, I don't know, but we need to change the incentive structure. I don't think it's about making good arguments. I think to some extent, a lot of these countries or their leaders are well aware of these challenges. It's just not perceived as a challenge that necessarily they will own themselves. So that needs to change. On the populism front, I think it's a difficult environment to be in an institution like this or like mine, where really what you're trying to do is develop the research and the ideas to drive productive policy. And it isn't research and ideas that are driving policy to the extent we'd like to see. So
we really don't matter, do we?
I think on one hand, we matter because if we pack up and go home and say multilateralism and global health doesn't matter, then there's no one there it's not obviously up to you and I, but the more of us that do that, the more of it that we don't realize the importance of these issues. And again, part of the point of the book is trying to reframe this conversation and connect it to things that people do care about, which again, migration, how cities are growing, the fortunes of economy. And we spend so much time in global health talking about how everything affects health. What is the health of migrants? What's the urban health? And all this is really important, but we don't spend enough time connecting how health matters to other issues. And this book is an attempt to try to address that, and we're looking to do that more. And I think that is really the avenue in which you do make progress, potentially, with populists to the extent that you connect it to issues that they do care about. I've been interesting, a good friend and colleague who's here spends a lot of his time talking about caravans currently and the connection to aid. And while I suspect there are a lot of people who would like to be talking less about caravans, currently, to the extent that at least is focusing on the mind around aid policies in these countries, there are some opportunities there too, and we should look into them.
Well, I think another answer for both audiences is that no, people don't like chaos, and at the end of the day, they may be inclined to be disruptive, but only up to a point. In other words, the reaction to having all of these various bombs arrive in people's mailboxes,
Yeah.
I think struck across the spectrum a moment of shock, because no one wants to see that happen. And there's a certain threshold. And in the sense of, you're talking about global mega trends that if not corrected or managed better, are going to create a world that we all have to live in.
Yeah.
That is not going to be very pleasant. Some of us will obviously be spared the worst of it, but it's a vision that it seems to me should be able to connect to people of almost any description ideologically at some level, even though you're going to clearly run up against some pretty serious problems with the populist nationalist outlook. So, was it fun writing this book, Tom?
Fun is strong. It's more fun to talk about this book, so I am grateful for that opportunity. So thanks for having me.
And what's the reception been so far?
So the reception has been pretty good so far. We Fareed Zakaria was nice enough to do a 5-minute segment on the book. We have something happening with NPR.
That's on CNN?
That's on CNN. The reviews have been good. It is a difficult environment in which to make news, because we have the occupant of the White House makes a lot of news himself every day, so the opportunities are a challenge. But I think for a book like this, which at the end of the day is intended to be readable, but really is a substantive book, it has been pleasing to see how many people have grabbed hold of it as they have.
Thank you. I will be publishing a short review in The Lancet about 2 weeks on this. And thank you so much, and congratulations. I mean, I think this really is a major contribution and a major achievement, prodigious amount of effort, and you should feel really proud of this. And I think we're all grateful to you, so thank you.
Thank you so much.